In the late summer of 1385, the Kingdom of Portugal stood on the edge of extinction. It was not a great empire, it was not a vast realm wrapped in mountains, protected by endless armies, or rich enough to hire victory by the pound. Portugal was small, exposed, and divided by a crisis of succession that had turned noble against noble, city against city, and neighbor against neighbor. Its throne was uncertain, its future was being argued not only in courts and councils, but in steel. To the east, Castile looked upon Portugal not as a rival, but as a prize. King John the of Castile claimed the Portuguese crown through marriage. To him, the matter was simple. Portugal had no secure king. Castile had armies, nobles, cavalry, and the confidence of a much larger kingdom. A union under Castilian power seemed inevitable. On parchment, it looked like destiny. On the road, it looked like conquest. But Portugal had chosen resistance. At the center of that resistance stood another John, João, master of Aviz. He was not born to rule in the clean, uncontested way kings prefer to be born. He was the illegitimate son of a Portuguese king, raised in the shadow of power rather than at its center. Yet in a moment when the old order cracked, he became the figure around whom Portugal's independence gathered itself. He had allies, but not enough. He had legitimacy, but it was challenged. He had courage, but courage alone does not stop heavy cavalry. Beside him stood the man who would shape the battlefield into a weapon, Nuno Álvares Pereira, the young constable of Portugal. Devout, disciplined, and dangerously intelligent, Nuno understood something that many nobles of the age refused to accept. A smaller army did not have to meet a larger army on equal terms. It had to make equality irrelevant. The Castilian army came with numbers, armor, and expectation. Contemporary accounts vary, and medieval figures often swell in the telling, but the truth beneath the exaggeration is clear. Castile brought a larger force. Its strength lay especially in cavalry, in mailed men used to deciding battles by the shock of a charge. Alongside them marched infantry and crossbowmen, supported by the confidence of a king who believed he was about to end the Portuguese question forever. The Portuguese army was smaller. It could not afford a war of open movement, not against a stronger enemy in its own land. It could not gamble on noble pride. It needed the ground itself to become an ally. Near the village of Aljubarrota, north of Lisbon, Nuno found the place. The Portuguese took position on a ridge, their front narrowed by terrain, their flanks guarded by obstacles and prepared defenses. Trenches, pits, and stakes were dug and set into the earth, not as monuments, but as traps. They were simple things: holes, ditches, sharpened timber, disturbed soil. But in war, simple things placed well can ruin the finest armor in the world. The Portuguese arranged themselves in a defensive formation. Men-at-arms stood with infantry, archers and crossbowmen waited. The line was not designed for glory. It was designed to endure the first blow, break the enemy's rhythm, and turn Castilian confidence into confusion. For the Castilians, this was an insult. A smaller army had dared to stand in their path. Worse, it had done so without offering the kind of battlefield their cavalry wanted. The Portuguese did not spread themselves across open ground like a feast for mounted knights. They crouched behind earthworks and waited. The Castilian king faced a choice. He could maneuver. He could delay. He could seek a better angle, a better day, a better field. But time was not a friend to an invading army, and pride rarely enjoys being kept waiting. The pressure to attack was immense. Nobles wanted action. The campaign demanded decision. The crown of Portugal seemed close enough to seize. So Castile advanced. The first assaults came against a position that looked weaker than it truly was. Heavy cavalry, built for momentum, found itself funneled toward prepared ground. Horses that should have thundered forward in a single crushing wave instead stumbled into broken approaches. Men fell, formations compressed. The terrible power of the charge began to dissolve before it could fully arrive. Then the Portuguese line answered. Arrows and bolts struck into the mass. Infantry braced. Men with pole arms and blades fought at close quarters against opponents who had expected movement, not obstruction. The Castilian attack did not crash through, it jammed. And in that jam, in that terrible crowding of bodies and armor and panic, the larger army began to lose the one advantage it had trusted most. Numbers became pressure from behind. Cavalry became trapped weight. Nobles who had entered the fight expecting honor found themselves in a killing ground shaped by men they had underestimated. The battlefield narrowed into chaos. Imagine the sound. Horses screaming, iron striking iron, commanders shouting orders that could not travel through the noise, dust lifting from the dry earth, men slipping in trenches they had not seen until the moment their feet vanished beneath them, standards swaying above the crush, then disappearing. The proud charge of Castile had become a struggle for breath, and still the Portuguese held. This was the hinge of the battle. A smaller force, if it bends too far, breaks all at once. The Portuguese line had no deep reserve of men to waste. Every gap mattered. Every fallen soldier had to be replaced by someone already exhausted. But Nuno's design had done its work. The enemy was not fighting the Portuguese army alone. It was fighting the slope, the pits, the stakes, the crowd, the collapse of its own formation. The Castilians pushed again. Their size did not vanish. Their courage did not vanish. These were not cowards. They were armed men of a powerful kingdom, and they understood what was at stake. If they broke Portugal here, the war might be decided in an afternoon. But the more they pressed, the more they fed the disaster. On the Portuguese side, the battle was not only military, it was existential. These men were not defending a border province in a routine campaign. They were defending the right of their kingdom to remain itself. Behind them lay towns, families, churches, fields, and the fragile idea that Portugal did not have to become an appendage of Castile. Defeat would not merely change a ruler, it could erase a future. That knowledge hardened the line. As the Castilian assault failed to break through, Portuguese forces began to counterattack where the enemy was disordered. The same narrow ground that had protected them now magnified Castile's confusion. Command became difficult, withdrawal became dangerous. Men in the rear could not understand what was happening at the front. The front could not easily fall back. The great army had entered the trap, and now its own mass held it there. Then came the moment every army fears. Confidence broke. Not everywhere at once, not like a curtain falling, but in pieces. A unit falters, a standard turns. A rumor passes faster than an order. Someone sees noblemen falling. Someone hears that the king is in danger. Someone begins to move backward, and the movement becomes permission. In medieval battle, once the shape of an army dissolves, courage is no longer enough. A brave man alone is still only a man surrounded. The Castilian army began to collapse. What had marched into Portugal as an instrument of royal destiny became a fleeing mass. Men who had come to claim a crown now fought to escape a field of broken earth. The retreat turned deadly. The Portuguese pursued. Castilian nobles were killed or captured. The losses were severe, especially among the elite whose armor, horses, and bloodlines had seemed to guarantee superiority. King John of Castile survived, but survival was not victory. He left behind the dream of a quick conquest. He left behind men who had trusted his claim. He left behind the prestige of a larger power publicly shattered by a smaller kingdom that had refused to kneel. Aljubarrota was more than a battle. It was a verdict. The victory secured the position of João, master of Aviz, who became King John III of Portugal. It strengthened a new dynasty and gave Portugal the breathing room it needed to remain independent. Castile did not simply lose soldiers that day, it lost the aura of inevitability. The idea that Portugal could be absorbed by force had been tested in open battle and thrown back in blood. For Portugal, the victory became foundational memory. In later years, the monastery of Batalha would rise as a monument to the triumph, stone-shaped into gratitude and defiance. Its arches and vaults would speak in silence for the men who had stood on that ridge. It was not merely a religious offering, it was a statement carved into the landscape. This kingdom survived when it was supposed to disappear. The Battle of Aljubarrota reminds us that history is not always written by the side with the larger army. Sometimes it is written by the side that understands the ground. Sometimes by the commander who sees discipline where others see only weakness. Sometimes by ordinary soldiers who hold a line long enough for an empire's certainty to crack. Castile came to Aljubarrota with a claim to a crown. Portugal answered with a ditch, a ridge, a smaller army, and the will to remain alive. And by sunset, the larger kingdom had learned that conquest is not a matter of size alone. A crown cannot be taken merely because a king desires it. A nation cannot be erased merely because its enemy has more horses, more banners, and more noble names. On that August day in 1385, the underdog did not survive by luck. It survived by preparation, nerve, and the cold refusal to fight the enemy's battle. Portugal turned weakness into design. It turned desperation into discipline. It turned a field near Aljubarrota into the place where a larger power came to be humbled. The Castilian army had marched in to settle the future. Instead, it became the warning. If history like this is what you're here for, subscribe to the Human Conflict Library. There's a lot more coming.